All right. Hey, everybody. My name is William Denius. I'm here with Guy Wallace, who is one of the ISPI masters, is what we are calling them. We're here talking about the ISPI Renaissance. So you've been a consultant since 1982. You're the founder of your own company, honorary life member of ISPI, past president. You've done a lot of things. And part of these interviews is for emerging professionals in the field, but also for those who are ISPI members and who still practice. So I wanted to start off by asking you, for those emerging professionals who are new in the field, um, you had a very strange way of getting into the field, it seems. Bachelor's degree in radio. Um, how'd you get here? You've got that experience in print and broadcast journalism as well. How'd you end up in performance improvement?
Well, to make a long story short, not that I can really do that, but I have a radio, TV, film degree, and I was working for Wix Lumber as an inside salesperson part-time as I was finishing up my college degree in Lawrence, Kansas, at the University of Kansas. And my manager had gone off to a management meeting, and he was my third manager in the 2.5 years that I had been there. And he heard that they were going to convert their training from 35 millimeter slides to video. And so he went up to the vice president of human resources and told him that he had to hire me. The vice president of human resources later told me when I was doing my interviews for the job at headquarters in Saginaw, Michigan, that all three of my managers had approached him independently and told him that he had to hire me. So he was going to hire me into some job in human resources regardless. But he wanted me to go work for the training services department and the new video group there. But I didn't get along with the video manager, who was the brother-in-law of Gary Rumler, and I had no idea who Gary Rumler was at the time. And so I interviewed with the program development department of three people. I would be the third. And those two people that I was going to be working with had just hired in 2 weeks before me, and they'd come from Blue Cross Blue Shield, where they had worked with Gary Rumler's brother. So so I just got into it because I had this job back in Lawrence, Kansas, and went to headquarters and got all involved in the training organization back in 1979. August 6th was my first day.
Wow, that seems like an interesting way to get into the field. Plus the Gary Rumler connection that you had there um, helped you eventually anyway. I wanted to ask, you've become sort of a stalwart in the field. I've seen your LinkedIn. You're always posting things. You've published many, 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 many books. Um, Now it seems like performance analysis and performance improvement, um, it's all kind of pushing toward um, using AI. What uh, what part of this work do you feel builds a more excuse me, is feels more important for the time, for this moment where we are?
Well, given the advent of artificial intelligence, augmenting human tasks or
Hmm.
displacing human tasks, it's extremely important, just like it has been for training and learning professionals since forever, is to be focused on the performance. What are the performance requirements? What are the outputs required? What are the tasks, the human tasks required? What are the stakeholder requirements or constraints for both the outputs and the process and the tasks? And so I think as we look to augment or displace human performance in the process, in the work streams, in the workflow, it's important to understand, what tasks are being performed. Now, this gets into not just the behavioral tasks that are quite overt and they are the doing tasks. We can see them, we can count them, we can measure them, but there's also the cognitive tasks, the covert tasks, the thinking tasks that we cannot see, we cannot count, we cannot measure. And those are extremely important because in my way of thinking, the cognitive tasks uh, parallel and augment the behavioral tasks. They come before, during, and after we're behaving. We're thinking about things before we do them, as we do them, and after we do them to make sure that we did okay and it's time to go on to the next step. And is the next step the standard step or some variant of that due to variations in the performance context? So AI is going to have all of that programmed in and itself be knowledgeable about those cognitive tasks so that it can perform the behavioral tasks or, again, augment the human tasks, augment the machine tasks, the automated tasks that probably already exist or may exist in the future. So I think this whole notion of we've got to focus in on the performance, which was later called the process, which was later called work streams, which is now being called workflows.
Mhm.
We need to help artificial intelligence get the inputs it needs in order for it to play a more appropriate role in performance going forward.
Yeah, and that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately as I learn more about AI, is that people are afraid that it's going to take jobs. It's not necessarily going to take jobs, especially in our field, because AI still needs guardrails and human guidance. So AI is a good help, it's a good tool to use. Um, but I don't think it's really going to take our jobs because it can't do exactly what a human can do.
Yeah,
So,
there's so many aspects to the learning and development process to start a project, to continue a project, to complete a project, and then to do continuous improvement or discontinuous improvement to the L&D products, whatever they be. Um, our jobs are going to change radically, but that's been the nature of the business since I got into it in 1979. You know, the only thing that's really changed has been the tools, the technology. You know, back in the day, technology stood for the application of science. So the science of
mhm,
learning, the science of performance hasn't really changed very much in all those decades. But the tool technology has changed radically, and it's changed our jobs, and it's created new jobs as well as deleting some other jobs. But there will always, I think, be a role for humans in the process because we are social creatures. Our clients, we have to do the hand holding with our clients. We have to do the explanations for our
mhm,
clients. It's not going to be just, machine to machine and lights out factory, there's no humans involved. So I would agree that it's not going to really take away many jobs. It may take away many roles that people have in
mhm.
the total mix of roles that are involved in learning and development.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree there. Well, we are in ISPI. They are in what they call a renaissance. We're trying to reclaim some things that ISPI has used for all these years. So back in 2002, you co-wrote with Gary Rumler ISPI's value proposition, um, what this field is about, what this field is for. You've quoted Rumler's line, "We can't get there from here." So when ISPI calls this a renaissance, a return to core disciplines, what's the thing that you personally would like to see reclaimed?
Well,
What does that mean to you?
so I think that it's hard to we can so easily overgeneralize, what L&D is, what performance improvement is or is not. And people are all over the board on where they are at personally in their application of their knowledge and skills in those two disciplines, which to me learning is a sub-discipline to performance, but not everybody looks at it that way. But I think that, what's really important in this renaissance is that we refocus on performance, performance first, second, and last, and in between there someplace, learning occurs. The society was generally 60% people who were in the learning space, as it's called nowadays. It's been called
Hmm.
instruction, it's been called training, education, etc. But most people came from that world where they created learning content of one nature or another. And if they weren't doing what Gilbert called, kind of beginning with the end in mind, focused on the worthy accomplishments, the results of performance, if they were focused on behaviors and trapped in the cult of behaviors, they were too focused on the means and not the ends, because behaviors, learning, competencies, knowledge, skills, etc., are all means of the ends of performance, which again is producing outputs that meet stakeholder requirements, performing tasks, both behavioral and cognitive tasks, that also meet stakeholder requirements. So I hope that the Renaissance gets us back to that performance orientation using the current set of tools and technologies in the technology, the science of performance improvement, in the science of learning, in the science of motivation, in the science, there's many variables to performance, and learning and development, addressing knowledge and skills is but one of those variables.
What did Rumler, Gilbert, Mager, Harless, all these people, what did they understand in their time that it seems like we've forgotten?
I really believe it goes back to performance. I mean, the
Hmm.
society started off as, the National Society for Programmed Instruction. And what I was told by Gary Rumler and Joe Harless on separate occasions was that basically they learned that having stellar uh, programmed instruction was not moving the needle, was not improving performance, and they all wondered why. This was happening in the mid 60s. ISPI and SPI was created in 1962, but by the late 60s, all the thought leaders had decided programmed instruction is not really the magic bullet, the silver bullet. It's not fixing everything. So what else do we got to attend to? And they all worked on this independently, and but their models, their methods, everything are somewhat similar, but they're different enough because they came at this, from their own efforts to basically understand what are the variables of performance. It's not just knowledge and skills. So what are those other variables? Now, parallel to all of this, the total quality management movement was in its infancy, and but the quality movement had been going on for a long time. And so everybody's looking at, how do we affect performance and what are the variables we need to better manage, better control, etc. And that was helpful to me, quite frankly. It was confusing at first, but then I realized, oh, there's more similarities than not. They're they're using different language and labels and imagery, but if you really step back and look at it, it's really pretty much the same thing. And so that was helpful to me in formulating my own philosophies, my own processes, my own practices in learning development, but with a performance orientation. And and one of the things that I learned, and it probably came from one of those thought leaders, I'm not sure who, was that it's just as important to avoid doing training when it's not going to solve the problem as it is to do a stellar job at training when it is appropriate, when it is part of the solution set. Seldom is it the singular solution to a performance problem. But if you got new hires, yeah, the problem is they don't know how to do the job. And so, training, learning is appropriate in that context. But if there's a performance problem, what the gurus found was that the numbers vary, but basically it's around 80% of the time it's got nothing to do with knowledge and skills. It's some other variable. It's the consequence system, or it's a lousy process, or it's something else, and it's not the human at all. But sometimes it's the human, but it's not about their knowledge and skills. It's about some other attribute or personal value. They could have a physical capability limitation or a psychological limitation or an intellectual limitation in terms of their ability to do the job. So, performance is quite complex, and I think that that's one of the things that they learned and tried to convey through their own work, their writings, what they shared at the society and at other places in terms of how can we look at this to improve performance. Um, Again, it's sometimes called the process or work streams, and nowadays it's called the workflow. But how do we do that? And so a lot of things were lost. The Rumler and Gilbert had a 1970 newsletter that I read 9 years later when I first started, my first day on the job, actually. And it was about guidance, the short way home. Well, by 9 years later, that was already better known as job aids. Now we call it performance support, but in between it had been called electronic performance support systems. But it's akin to standard operating procedures, SOPs. It provides guidance in the workflow, and you don't need a course necessarily to follow the step-by-step instructions, depending on your incoming knowledge and skills. Um, but I think that those are some of the things that have been lost and reinvented over time. We keep on changing the language, the labels, and the imagery that's been used, and that makes it harder for new people coming in. But that's just the nature of the beast. And I think that people can look at that, the emerging professionals can look at that as an opportunity to learn the variances in how people talk about this as they construct their own set of philosophies, their own processes on how to do the work, their own practices within those processes.
Yeah, that has been difficult as an emerging professional. Still working through my doctorate to make sense of the frameworks, the models, the methods. It all sounds the same sometimes, but you're right.
Yeah.
They are all very similar. You just have to kind of take a step back and, like you said, see the perspective that that person is coming uh, to that tool from. I want to shift gears just a second, um, and focus on a little bit more on learning and design. A lot of people that I've met in this field so far, it seems like when I went to the conference in Nashville, there were a lot of instructional designers there. Let's speak to the instructional designers for a second. Why is it so hard for people to stop taking orders for courses, to just build and build and build where they may lose that quality in their building?
Well, this is something that I don't put on the shoulders of the practitioners. I put it on the
Mhm.
shoulders of the learning and development leaders. They've not gone out and made the case and sold the need to have a performance orientation. And then what are their philosophies about learning? What's it for? Learning for the sake of learning or learning for the sake of performance? And then how would you measure that? So I've had leaders in the past and clients in the past who were good at selling internally why we're going to do it this way. What's the benefit to everybody? And yeah, maybe a longer row to hoe, but here's the benefits of that. We're going to have measurable impact on performance in the business metrics, not in some learning metrics about completions or satisfaction or whatever. Um, but I think that, the late Joe Harless in 1985 at an NSPI conference said, when a client comes to you and asks you for some training, you don't say in your whiniest voice, are you sure it's a training problem? No, you say, yes, I can help you, and I can help you even more if I can do this front end analysis. That was his term
Mhm.
for basically performance analysis. And so it's your order fulfillment process. You should take the order. You're in a service function. You're not in the lead. You're not leading the enterprise. You're not leading the corporation. You are there to support and serve the other functions in the corporation who are there to carry out the strategic plan and the current operational plans of the enterprise. And in learning and development, we help people learn to master their jobs and we can develop them for future jobs, for wherever they might go next within the organization. Um, So I do believe you do take the order, but you just don't run off and build a course on content, on topics, on knowledge, on skills, and all that stuff. You first do what I call performance analysis to understand, what are the outputs people are supposed to be producing? How do you measure one? How do you know a good output from a bad one? What are the tasks then that are necessary and who does what? Does the learner, the target audience, do they do all the tasks or are they collaborating with others? Let's get some clarity about task performance on the way to producing a worthy output. And then we can begin to look at, well, are there masters who are doing this really well? And what are the gaps between them and the others? When I start off with where do the measures for outputs typically aren't being met? Because that's the first signal I look for. If you can't get the output to be, to meet the standards, to meet the measures, that other people are proving can be done, well, we start there. That's a typical deficiency. So, what are the causes? Is it because they don't know what to do, how to do it? Is it because they have a poor process? I've had many master performers over the years in analysis sessions tell me they're not going to follow the corporate process because that would be stupid. They do it differently. And then they would argue about, how they each do it, and it's all somewhat similar but different, and sometimes their contexts were different and that's the cause for the differences, but sometimes we got a lousy process, and so if we don't help our clients understand what are all the variables to performance, and besides knowledge and skills, if it even is knowledge and skills, what are the causes, what are the root causes for performance problems? Because maybe once we're done with analysis, we might reach what I call the L&D pivot point, where we inform our clients with the analysis data that's credible, that's valid, that's believable, so that they can make the business decision. Do we continue with this learning and development effort, or do we pivot away to some other solution set? Maybe we need to work on the consequence system or the process or the tools or the data and information people are working with. And do we need to continue with the learning as well, or maybe not? And if we were to continue with learning, do we really need learning to occur, or can we provide performance guides, job aids, performance support, so that, does the performance context demand a memorized performance response, or does it allow for a referenced performance response? For far too long, we've been packaging content in training, learning, whatever, and shoving that out at learners who are performers. And maybe they didn't need, and we're forcing them to memorize things that aren't necessarily memorized, don't need to be memorized, back out on the job. So if we don't understand that performance contest and context and what's required to be memorized and what could be referenced in the moment in the performance, we do a disservice to our organizations, our clients, and our learners by forcing people to memorize things when they don't need to. Nobody sends you an IKEA training course on how to assemble a bookcase. They give you a set of instructions, and you follow those step by step, and voila, you're done. You may need to know, what's a screwdriver and what's a pliers, and they've got pictures to show you that. So they provide you with the guidance you need in order to be able to produce a worthy output. We need to do more things like that. We need to get away from packaging content on topics that don't even talk about how to apply them, and then don't provide sufficient practice with feedback. If people need to memorize things, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to give them information, demonstrations, and sufficient, authentic practice with feedback to really hone their ability to perform. But we too often we don't do that. We package up information and we think if they know, they should be able to do, and that's not necessarily true. There may be a consequence system back on the job that stops them from doing what they now know how to do. And if we hadn't helped uncover that with our clients, we're going to build learning content that's not going to have a positive ROI. The ROI might be nil or negative. We may have spent a bunch of money and didn't get the results. And so we've got all these sunk costs and we've got no way to recover them on behalf of the organization.
Yeah, it sounds like we're just taking useless interventions at that point and throwing the intervention and the product at them before we ever actually know what the actual issue is.
That's
So
it's
so yeah,
people are clients, are L&D leaders. They're looking for the easy path. They're looking to be efficient, but they're not looking to be effective. And we too often sacrifice effectiveness for some notion of efficiency. So we're very efficient at being ineffective, and that's sad.
yeah, I mean, it's my opinion that efficiency isn't quick. Efficiency takes a minute. You've got to learn everything that goes into what you're doing before you can be efficient at that thing. Um, I really enjoyed that conversation. That was very illuminating. Um, I want to shift gears again, going back to you as a practitioner and your involvement with um, performance improvement. You've been very candid about the Sturm und Drang, the storm and the stress, the politics of performance, and the C-suite's misreads of learning, um, what it takes to keep a good project alive. So, looking back at young Guy decades ago, starting at Wix Lumber and Motorola, what do you understand now that you wish you would have known then?
So again, since I was really oriented starting on day one, I mean, I was very, very lucky in my career, and I learned all about Rumler and Gilbert and Mager, and then soon Joe Harless. Um, so I had that performance orientation, but one of the things that I learned maybe 20 years later was a warning from a fellow ISPIer, Ted Apking in the Detroit area, who warned me to be a tool agnostic. His company
Hmm.
was serving the automotive industry in Detroit, and even in one company, there were different authoring tools that various departments were using. So he was having to hold the license for various authoring tools and all the versions, the newest, the one, two, and three back, and all of that. And it was killing them financially. And so he encouraged me not to get caught up in the tools that we were using, to be agnostic, to use whatever the client used. And so my practice was, to use the client's tools. If they hired me to do a project, then my staff would use their tools to serve them. And that way I didn't have to hold all these licenses of this ever evolving and ever changing landscape of the digital technology that we were using. And it was constantly evolving. So I think that's one of the things. And so I took that, being a tool agnostic to being a solution set agnostic of uh, of everything, because I shouldn't get locked in on something that we had mastered and learned and could do it over and over again, because that soon would change. And so I think that while the science of learning and the science of performance improvement haven't really changed very much, it's all of these tools and techniques that we can use that have evolved. And so we need to remain flexible with that. We should not get locked in. People are worried right now about all the L&D authoring tools that people have spent time mastering, and will AI displace the need for some of them, all of them, or what? And so all that remains to be seen. There's a new way, there's new technology. But if you're not focused on the performance, if you're performance on, if you don't begin with the end in mind and you're beginning with the middle, you're focused on topics or knowledge or skills or behaviors or competencies, but you don't have a clear idea of how that applies in the process, in the workflow, the tools are not going to save you. You're going to produce a bunch of content, and then you're going to force a learner from formal learning into informal learning, trial and error, social learning. And that's okay if the stakes, the rewards, and the risks are low. But if those risks and rewards are high, we really need to do a better job of understanding the entirety of the performance context and what people need to do And most likely it's not rote performance. So there's going to be a need for them to vary what they do depending on the variations in that performance context. We need to help them learn how to think about the performance context situationally. And what should we do and how should we do it? And is it the same as last time or do I need to vary it for some reason this time? That's, I think, what's important.
I love that you brought up backward design there. As a classroom teacher, that's one of my favorite things. Um, Even when I'm writing treatment plans, I begin with the end in mind. So I appreciate your nod to backward design there. Um, so you talked about projects that you've done. You mentioned, doing projects. What's a project that has humbled you?
Okay, this goes back to 1987, and my business partner had gotten a project with NASA. And because the Challenger accident had happened in 1986, I was working with AT&T Network Systems, the old Western Electric part of AT&T, and I was very, very busy with a whole bunch of projects with them. But I was brought in after some analysis had been done on managers and managers' performance, and I was asked to design a curriculum architecture design with the analysis team, who now became my design team. And the people in the room were all these NASA employees who had worked with all of the people that had died in the Challenger accident. And the two people in my firm who had done the analysis warned me that it was going to be a very emotional and stressful meeting. And normally these meetings ran 2 to 3 days, and this was a 3 day meeting. But these people cried throughout the 3 day meeting because every time we talked about an output or a set of tasks or the knowledge and skills required, it triggered something in them to remember those people who had died. And it was very humbling because I like to move fast and keep things going, but I had to stop continuously and let the group express their emotions and talk about these individuals. And it didn't change the flow of my work, but just changed the pacing of it. And I learned that I had to myself be situationally appropriate and not push people, which is really what I tended to do. If we would get off track in other meetings, I would try to get everybody back on track and get going. But I couldn't do that because of the nature for them getting off track. So I think that that was a very humbling experience for me.
Hmm. I do think there's something to be said about being empathetic in this field when you work with stakeholders in all kinds of situations. You don't know exactly what's going on behind the scenes. So that's something that I personally always try to build in to my presentations or any talk that I have is that empathy. Um,
Yeah.
so what are think of one of your mentors. What are some words they had for you that clicked years later?
Oh, there's way too many. But I'll tell you my short story. So I started writing a book in 1983 and I finished it
Mhm.
in 99. So 16 years later, I finished my book that was titled Lean ISD, and I borrowed the lean concept from The Machine That Changed the World, part of a book that was an analysis of the Japanese automotive industry versus the American automotive industry. But I had called up my buddy Gary Rumler, who was my consultant at Motorola. Not only did I learn from him indirectly in my first job, in my second job, I learned from him directly because I got a chance to work with him on a whole bunch of projects. But in 99, I called him up and I said, "Hey, I've written this book and I've attributed my performance analysis methodology to you. And if you don't like what I've written, what I've done with it, I'll take it out. I'll change it. I'll take your name out of this." And he said, "Well, come on down and visit me." So I went to Tucson to spend 2 days with him, and we reviewed my book. And at one point, I asked him, "How am I ever going to repay you for everything that you've done for me. And he was writing at the whiteboard. And he turned to me and he said, "You can't." And then he went back to writing. And I thinking, he was kind of a jokester, dry humor. And I said, what? And he stopped and he turned to me and he said, you're going to have to do what I had to do. I could not pay back my mentors either. All we can do is pay it forward. Now, that rang so true in 99 for the 20 years that I'd been part of NSPI, ISPI, that it was an organization that shared. And that was my experience with all the thought leaders. I mean, even the Joe Harless, the rough, gruff Joe Harless, if you went and asked him a question, he would say, "You got any money?" And then after, 20 seconds, he would say, "No, what do you want to know?" And then he was, friendly and all that stuff, but he had this gruff exterior, the role he played. And I think that, so the sharing of others and paying it forward what you've learned from others and giving appropriate attribution for, this thing that you're doing. Where did it come from? Did you create this out of whole cloth? Where, did you make this up? What was your inspiration? What did you learn from others that caused you to, build or fashion whatever it was that you've got going? So that became even more important to me. I knew it was important. It had been modeled by all the thought leaders. I mean, all of them. And so that became important. And that's really part of my mission in my retirement here is to help, learning and development functions, leaders, and practitioners to become more performance oriented. I want to share with them, what I learned and where it came from so that they might, adopt what they can and adapt the rest. That's one of my little mottos that I've been doing that. I've been adopting and adapting things that I've learned since day one. And I encourage other people to do the same kind of thing. Um, but again, all the thought leaders had a very similar message, even though they said it differently, they wrote it differently, but it was really all about begin with the end in mind, begin with what we called back in the day the terminal performance. What do you want people to do, and why are they doing that? What are they trying to produce? So begin with what they're trying to produce, and then back into what are they doing to try to produce that, and then you can ask, well, what do they got to know?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm glad that you had that experience so that you can share those experiences with other people. Um, and that's one thing that I've experienced with ISPI as well. At the conference, sitting at round tables with people, they're just freely giving of themselves. They want everyone to succeed, and I think that's what's probably the best thing about ISPI from my perspective. You've talked a little bit about what you've done in your retirement. You give away all these resources, all this advice. You spent decades trying to, help people. Um, if you could put one thing directly into the hands of somebody just starting out today, a principle or a habit, what would that be?
I think regardless of where it all starts, where a request starts or whatever, you need to somehow get to, you might start in the middle with a conversation. Somebody wants some training on something, but you need to somehow shift their perspective and shift the effort to that terminal performance. And so one of the things that I came up with probably by the mid 80s was if a client asked me for training on a topic or a skill or a competency, I would nod my head and say yes, but then I would shift it by saying, so what would authentic practice with feedback look like? And that shifted everything to because and I learned something from Neil Rackham, the spin selling guru, back in 1981. And he had asked, I was having trouble with my clients at Motorola who didn't want to see a lot of practice in the training that I was trying to produce. And he knew that. And he had a chance to meet with me and my clients. And he said, do any of you guys play golf or tennis? And these are all manufacturing executives. And they all said, oh, yeah, we play golf and tennis. And he goes, did you ever take a lesson? And they go, oh, yeah. And he said, did they ever try to change your grip? And each and every one of them, probably a dozen people in the room, said, "Oh yeah, they changed my." He go, "What happened to ball control?" "Oh, the ball went here, there, everywhere, but where I wanted it to." And he said, "So what did you do? Revert to the old grip because you had more control that way?" And they all stopped because they realized that they had just fallen into his trap. And he said, "Yeah, and he brought out a little flute and he was playing it. And he said, my instructor tells me that I'm no good at this. And because I don't raise my fingers appropriately, blah, blah, blah. And so what you need in practice and feedback is a coach, giving you reinforcing feedback and corrective feedback until you have ball control. If the coach was there saying, maintain that grip on the tennis racket and don't revert to the old grip, maintain the other one, and practice, practice until the results become reinforcing. And if we don't get people through that learning curve, that performance curve, to where their results are reinforcing of their new behavior, their new grip, their new knowledge, their new skill, um, we've done them a disservice because they'll revert to the old way where they had some better control, they had a better understanding of what they were doing. And so, if we don't provide the sufficient practice with feedback, they'll never get there. Well, then all my clients were happy about that. And so when I said 60% of the training is going to be in practice with feedback, they all said, "Oh yeah, we get it now." And so I wish that people could, find a way in their context to shift the conversation at some point, timing is everything, to what would practice with feedback look like? What do we really want them to be doing on the job with this? You can start off with a topic, but let's talk about the end in mind and get everybody focused on that. And then we can figure out how that topic or that skill or that competency or that behavior fits into that performance to generate the worthy outputs that we would want.
Thank you very much for this talk, for your focus on the end and the feedback, which I do think is very important. And I think sometimes it's what we forget. We just see the product and oh, okay, and then we do the feedback later instead of in the moment when it's really needed. Thank you very much for this talk. It's been a privilege. I'm very glad to meet you, to know you, and to learn from you. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, William. Have a good day.
You too.